How significant is this reset in the context of post-Brexit UK-EU relations?
Thanks for the invitation. Well, I would say that the current position of the United Kingdom not really surprising if we look on the longer perspective, because London was always a close ally, well, of Washington for sure in the past, before the Trump mandate. But it has been as well a strong supporter of NATO and more generally what I would call a pro-Western strategic agenda. So it's opposed consistently to any, let's say, moves or towards geopolitical independence from other countries or blocs, Russia, India, or others. And moreover, UK is also part of the Five Eyes. So I think it's rather consistent with its more traditional approach.
Mr. Swenson, from your perspective, how will this deal be received by the British public, especially Brexit supporters?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a kind of a split opinion in the UK. On the one hand, from a defense and security perspective, this is good news. It's probably really good news for the UK because they've been spending over 2%, close to 2.5% of their GDP on defense, whereas the rest of the continent, or at least the bigger economies, have not been meeting those standards. So I think this is good news to bring the rest of the continent on board and get closer to, 2.5%, 3%, even get up to 5% at one point. So I think that's a welcome news. The economic partnership, or they call it the reset, I call it more of a repeat. That's being met with a lot more criticism. I think the conservative elements in the United Kingdom, view it as a move back toward the EU and the rejection of Brexit. And so I think that's going to be met with some challenges. You've already seen lots of criticism from both parties on the right, from Reform and from the Conservative Party. And I do think by, in many ways, re-entering the regulatory scheme of the EU and also just completely abandoning the fishermen, this is somewhat of a rejection of Brexit. I think there'll be some real criticism. I think it's a mistake personally, but I think Keir Starmer felt some pressure to do some sort of a deal. So in many ways, again, this is a repeat of the Theresa May Chequers deal, which ultimately led to her defeat and the rise of Boris Johnson and the Get Brexit Done concept back in 2019.
Professor Jacquet, what do you see as the main drivers behind this renewed cooperation, in your own opinion?
Well, I think it's the need for continental European countries to create a new bloc that would, in a way, replace or rather continue the previous policy followed by Mr. Biden, or as well the other previous administrations, to confront Russia. It's a form, I would say, of translatio imperii, when you have the end of the Roman Empire and other political entities would like to keep this legacy. So it's more or less what I see here. There's a continuation of the usual, let's say, NATO or pro-Western agenda, especially when it comes to the confrontation against Russia. Mr. Starmer was in Kiev as well, Mr. Zelensky with Macron, and they have the same position, which, by the way, is highly debatable with regard to the outcomes it's bringing.
Mr. Swenson, now, do you view the alignment with the European Union standards as a necessary compromise or a step back from Brexit's goals?
Yeah, probably the latter. It's a bit of a step back. I thought the U.S.-UK trade deal announcement not quite 2 weeks ago was a step in the right direction. It was another example of the success, or it could be viewed as a success of Brexit, that the UK was able to negotiate their own agreement and not be under the constraints of the EU regulatory scheme. I think now, just less than 2 weeks later, they're stepping back into that. And I do think that's going to present more challenges for trading partners outside of the trading bloc that don't necessarily want to meet or conform to the EU regulatory regime. Hopefully, I was hoping they would actually liberate their economies more than regulate their economies. And in fact, I think by doing this, it's back to regulation.
I would want to elaborate on that with you, but I will go back now to Professor Jacquet. Now, what role did the Trump administration's policies play in pushing the UK and EU closer together?
I weighed the will from President Trump to strike a deal at any cost in Ukraine, the pressures he made as well on Zelensky, the channels he reopened with Russia, seen as very threatening for NATO countries, especially for France and UK. This would mean that, first of all, their strategy is wrong, and all the previous efforts they conducted are not bringing the effects they expected. So I guess that's the reason why we have this new bloc forming, to make sure that all the past efforts against Russia will not be lost or done in vain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.